Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is consideration of Business Motion 9409 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move the motion, please.
Moved.
Okay. As no member is asked to speak against the motion, I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 9409 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments members should have, the bill is amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 34A. The marshalled list, that is SP Bill 34AML. The correction slip to the marshalled list, that is SP Bill 34AML correction, and the groupings, and that is SP Bill 34AG. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds, and thereafter I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible after I call that group. Members should now please refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And we turn to Group 1, which is Financial Education for Debtor. And I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Minister, which is in a group on its own. And I ask the Minister to move and speak to the amendment, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Could I begin by declaring at the time a non-practising solicitor, member of the Law Society of Scotland and a member of the High Scot Credit Union. Presiding Officer, almost all of the amendments that the Scottish Government is bringing forward are in response to arguments put by stakeholders, including ICAS, the Citizens Advice Bureau, Law Society, Step Change and others, as well as MSPs. Our proposals in the bill relating to financial education are groundbreaking. They are a step towards a financial NHS for Scotland. As part of our financial health service, the most financially vulnerable will benefit from education designed to build their financial capacity and help prevent repeated debt problems. There has been support throughout the bill process for financial education being an integral part of the system. What we have delivered through the bill provides the platform for further action to build the financial capability of individuals and families across Scotland. Maximising the opportunity for education of our young people is also vital if we are to prevent future generations experiencing problem debt. Initiatives such as Glasgow City Council's project to commit £10 to a credit union savings account for every S1 pupil are commendable aspirations, worthy of consideration and something we want to discuss with credit unions. The importance of encouraging young people to save and to understand the value of money cannot be overstated. Amendment 3 before us at the moment is fairly minor. It takes up a suggestion from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland that a trustee in bankruptcy must advise the debtor within 6 months of the start of their bankruptcy if they are required to undergo a programme of financial education. Providing clarity early in the process will be helpful for the individual. It will ensure financial rehabilitation is not delayed and that they can benefit from a programme of learning during their bankruptcy. This small change has come about as a result of listening to those with an interest in this matter. In moving the amendment, I ask that Parliament supports it.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member has asked to speak, do you wish to add anything? In which case the question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I turn to Group 2, Common Financial Tool, and I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendments 5 and 7, and I ask the Minister to move Amendment 4 and please speak to all of the amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you. The proposal for a common financial tool has been discussed extensively during the Parliament's consideration of the bill, and rightly so. One of the key principles of the bill is that those who can pay their debts should pay their debts. The assessment of an individual's ability to pay must therefore be done in a way which is both consistent and fair. Mandating the use of a common financial tool across the money advice and insolvency sector is a significant step forward and one which has been widely supported both across the sector and by the committee. Ongoing discussions with stakeholders have led us to clarify our intentions in relation to the tool, which you will recall will be the Common Financial Statement operated by the Money Advice Trust. Presiding Officer, Amendments 4, 5 and 7 make minor adjustments in that light. Amendment 4 responds to stakeholder queries about whether assets or liabilities would be used in setting how much it is appropriate that debtors generally should pay. The amendment makes clear that the specific power to prescribe a method for assessing the debtor's assets, income, liabilities and expenditure is aimed at assessing the particular debtor's financial circumstances. Assets could still be relevant, but, for instance, as part of assessing the debtor's income as part of their financial circumstances and not more widely. Amendment 5 ensures that the regulations setting out the tool can use the Common Financial Statement whilst making any necessary adjustments. Likewise, Amendment 7 makes clear that in setting a debtor contribution order, the accountant of bankruptcy must also use the Common Financial Tool. I believe these amendments bring the necessary clarity, Presiding Officer. I ask for Parliament's support of them, and I move Amendment 4 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. And again, since no one else wishes to speak in this group, would you wish to add anything else? Thank you. The question then is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, which has already been debated with Amendment 4, and I ask the Minister to move formally.
Formally moved.
Many thanks. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 3, Minor and Technical, and I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with other amendments as shown in the groupings.
Thank you,
I ask the Minister to move Amendment 6 and speak to all amendments in the group. Minister.
My apologies, Presiding Officer. This is a group of minor amendments which make certain technical corrections and improvements to the bill. I am pleased that they include points made by stakeholders such as the Scottish Law Commission and Step Change Debt Charity. These amendments will ensure that the legislation reads and has effect accurately. I can speak to any of the individual amendments in more detail, copious detail, if members so desire, but I do not propose to go through each of these minor points at this stage. I therefore move Amendment 6 and invite members to support Amendments 6, 9, 66 and 74 to 82 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member has asked to speak, the question then is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Call Amendment 7 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 4, and I ask the Minister to move formally, please.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. We now turn to Group 4, Length of Contribution Period in respect of debtors' income and estate, and I call Amendment 1 in the name of Jenny Mara, which is grouped with Amendment 2, and I ask Jenny Mara to move Amendment 1 and speak to both amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This amendment will be familiar to members who have been following this debate as it progresses through Parliament. As it did at Stage 2, this amendment seeks to reverse the practical effects of bankruptcy for Scots from 4 years to 3, maintaining the status quo that Lloyds Bank has described as an adequate payment period. Now, without going over old ground, Presiding Officer, I simply want to note the contents of Citizens Advice Scotland in their Stage 3 briefing, which refute some of the assertions made by the Minister at Stage 2, namely that the move will not cause undue hardship. Citizens Advice Scotland state, increasing the payment contribution period by a further year is very likely to cause hardship. Bankruptcy is for those who are in major need of debt relief, and additional year of payments, administration fees and charges will not help get them that relief. As noted again by the Citizens Advice Scotland, this proposal is intended to do one thing: cover the costs of the accountant in bankruptcy, who, under this bill's proposals, are taking a great swathe of functions currently overseen by our courts. Yes.
Minister.
Can I assure Ms Mara that it is most certainly not the intention of the amendment to cover the accounted bankruptcy's costs? And can I also inform her that in a letter I have from the Lloyds Banking Group, Ewan McPherson, the head of fraud operations, states, as a result of our discussion and the additional assurance provided that the rule would only be applied where there is a proven ability to make payments over the extended time, I believe the bank should be able to support the provision.
Jenny Mara.
Well, I thank the Minister for that assurance. It's not the quote I have from Lloyds, but perhaps we can check that later. But to go on to the point I was making, Presiding Officer, the reason that this is happening is described in the Government's policy memorandum for the bill, and I quote, "It is considered that the courts are under increasing pressure from civil and criminal business. As a result of this, access to justice may take longer than previously anticipated, with sheriffs spending more time dealing with chambers work than with courtroom business." Now, it was not so long ago as a member of the Justice Committee, it was not so long ago as a member of the Justice Committee and again in this chamber that these benches argued strongly against the SNP's decision to close 10 sheriff courts across Scotland on the very grounds that it would cause increased pressure to the courts. And I can't help feeling, Presiding Officer, if the Government at the time had the foresight to take our advice, we now wouldn't be in a position where we are passing on the cost of closing down courts to some of the most vulnerable and financially excluded people in Scotland. There is no greater iniquity, and I believe the Government will come to regret this. Now, there was no great support for this change during consultation, which can be made no clearer than the Accountants in Bankruptcy's analysis of the consultation, which states quite clearly the majority of respondents who answered this question felt that this product was not required. And furthermore, And furthermore, the Law Society and many others have questioned its effectiveness. And for those reasons, Presiding Officer, I would ask members to support Amendment 1. Would you like me to continue to Amendment 2 now?
Yes, I have to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Thank you. Amendment 2 seeks to reinstate automatic discharge for bankruptcies. Again, I moved this amendment at stage 2 and spoke against the bill's proposals to end automatic discharge during stage 1. And I recognise the Minister has moved in this area at stage 2 and again today to clarify the process of discharge and make it easier. However, I simply want to put on record the advice of the European Commission. And they state that discharge should be as automatic and as reasonably limited in time as possible. And I do wonder whether scrapping automatic discharge as we have now is fulfilling that criteria. We have heard from ICAS that the move could have serious unintended consequences. And I would stress again, as I did at stage 2, in the interests of getting debtors financially active again, that the provision within this bill will be seen as a hindrance and not a help. I would therefore ask members to support Amendment 2, and I move both amendments in my name.
Thank you very much. I have several members who wish to contribute. I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As this is my first contribution to the debate, I should declare my interest as a member of the Law Society of Scotland. I wish to speak to Jenny Marra's Amendment number 1, which seeks to reduce the contribution period proposed in the bill from 48 months to 36 months. And as Jenny Marra said, this is an issue the committee debated at some length at stage 1 when we prepared a report, and was again debated in an amendment put forward at stage 2. On both those occasions, I, on behalf of my party, reserved our position on it. I think, however, when we get to stage 3, it is make up your mind time. Therefore, I have made up my mind. And I am minded not to support Jenny Marra's Amendment number 1, just with one caveat, which I'll come to in a moment. And I say that for 2 reasons. First of all, because the 48-month period is, I understand, already existing in law in relation to protected trust deeds. And it seems to me to make sense to have similar provisions in relation to bankruptcy. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, I think as a matter of principle, debtors should aim to repay as much as they can to their creditors of the money that is owed. And extending the contribution period to 48 months would allow more money to be repaid. I am not convinced that there would be undue hardship caused by this 12-month extension. Indeed, I suspect there would be relatively few cases in which this particular measure would apply. The one additional point I wanted to make, I picked up from the Law Society of Scotland's briefing for this debate this afternoon, where, whilst not opposing the increase in the period to 48 months, they do ask for it to be closely monitored, and if problems arise, the Scottish Government should act swiftly in order to rectify them. I think that's an eminently sensible suggestion, and if the Minister is happy to give me and undertaking that he will take such action if required, I would be very happy to support the Government's position and oppose Amendment 1.
Thank you. Alison Johnston, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you. I'd like to speak in support of Jenny Mara's amendments in this group. I supported similar ones at stage 2, and I still believe we should not be increasing the contribution period. Nobody is suggesting that people who can afford to pay their debts should not do so, but it became clear to me in evidence that a very broad spectrum of organisations were against the move to 4 years. We heard from money advice NGOs, professional bodies such as R3, the Association of Business Recovery Professionals, and Carrington Dean, creditors such as Lloyds Banking Group and the Consumer Finance Association, who were all against the increased period. That's creditors and debtors against the measure, although I recognise the view of the credit unions who welcomed the increase. But David Hill from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland said, "I believe that the longer a payment period is, the more likely it is that breakage will come. That is not to say that a period of 4 years will not work, but the longer the period is, the more people's circumstances change, and the more likely it becomes that a breakage will happen." Yes?
Chick Brodie. Could I have Chick Brodie's microphone, please? Mr Brodie, is your card in? Could we have Chick Brodie's mic?
That's it. Thank you. In the policy memorandum, you'll agree that, and this happened to occur during our conversation, that there was a requirement for certainty, which you just underpinned. And the policy memorandum says quite clearly that the arrangement, the 48 months, can be varied should the debtor's circumstances change. And you've just mentioned the changes that are possible, or in certain circumstances to result in a shorter or a longer repayment period. Do you not agree with that?
Alison Johnston.
I am minded to listen to the evidence of the many experts who came before the committee, whose views were quite clearly stated. They believe there is a greater chance of breakage, and why put yourself in a position of then having to address these breakages? The Law Society of Scotland said that the Society considers that there is insufficient evidence that a debtor contribution order for 4 years will improve returns to creditors, which is, surely one of the major points. And also, the committee received correspondence from a practitioner with more than a decade's experience in debt advice and personal insolvency. He said that if Section 4 is implemented as proposed in the bill, Scotland will have the longest formal bankruptcy period in the UK. And he went on to say that in his experience, after working for over 10 years in this industry, it is usually only the lower income debtors who cannot meet creditor criteria and protected trust deeds who choose sequestration. To extend the payment period would therefore mean it will be the lowest income, poorest Scottish debtors who will pay more than is expected of them in other parts of the UK. And the Minister has previously stated, and Murdo Fraser made the point earlier this afternoon, that the new debt arrangement scheme, which the committee supported, included a period of 48 months. But those regulations were introduced before we had the chance to take full evidence, and when we did, the issue emerged. We have an opportunity, Presiding Officer, to get the details right in the primary legislation, so we should do so now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Malcolm Chisholm.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to support the two amendments put forward by Jenny Mara. On Amendment 1, I believe it wasn't in the original consultation, and when it was subsequently consulted on, it was a minority of respondents who supported the government's current position. The Minister says it was not to cover costs. I'll be interested to hear a speech to say what the reason was. Murdo Fraser tried to give a reason. Perhaps he's going to tell me now.
Minister.
Would Mr Chisholm accept that, in fact, in the consultation, views were sought about how long a contribution period should be in a payment product, and those who responded, a clear majority, supported a longer period of, in fact, 5 years than we are now fixing, which is 4 years, including virtually all credit unions who responded?
Well, there were particular reasons for credit unions, but it's not my understanding of it. But obviously, the Minister, I'll look further into that. But my understanding was it was, well, let's put it this way, it was certainly opposed by a very large number of organisations whom I would normally pay close attention to. I await the reason, and no doubt in his summing up, Murdo Fraser attempted to give a justification in terms of protected trustees, but I think they're an entirely different category of arrangement. Jenny Mara gave the main reasons and referred to the Citizens Advice Bureau briefing, and certainly that's an organisation that I and I hope others always pay close attention to, and Alison Johnson, of course, talked around some of those issues as well. Many will have to pay more, and as she emphasised, that will tend to be the poorest. It will mean that they find it harder to get back on their feet. There will be new opportunities to miss contributions. It may result in a growing number of debtors who cannot maintain their contributions, and in general it will increase hardship. As Alison Johnson also said, it will be the longest formal bankruptcy period in the UK, and my understanding is it may well be the longest in the EU, since 3 years is the norm throughout the EU. Now, the Law Society proposes that it should be monitored, and certainly if this amendment is defeated, I think that is certainly something that can be and should be asked for, and no doubt that may come up again in the final debate. Now, Murdo Fraser discussed Amendment 1 but not Amendment 2, which intrigued me because, of course, it was his committee that was not persuaded by the ending of automatic discharge. His committee said it had unintended consequences, and his committee called on the Scottish Government to clarify the circumstances in which a debtor would be assessed as not having cooperated with the trustee. And that, of course, is a concern also of the Citizens Advice Bureau, who say that the criterion that the debtor must cooperate is too broad because it does not say what cooperation means. Perhaps that will also be clarified in the summing up by the Minister. But again, it's a matter of concern when these matters are not on the face of the bill, and so it is open to a great deal of discretion. Now, of course, this is amending, this particular provision, the Bankruptcy Scotland Act 1985, which was extremely welcomed when it was introduced. It was perhaps, with due respect to Murdo Fraser, one of the few pieces of legislation in the 1980s that was extremely welcomed. The Law Society indeed says, and I'm quoting, when the Bankruptcy Scotland Act 1985 said that people could have automatic discharge, it was seen as a huge step forward that would stop people ending up in bankruptcy in perpetuity for various reasons. So I hope the Minister and the colleagues behind him, I hope that gives them pause for thought when they reflect that on this particular issue they are well to the right of the Conservative Party.
Thank you. Minister, can I invite you to contribute?
Could I begin by referring to the arguments in relation to Amendment 2 and just deal with them? I think perhaps Ms Mara doesn't appreciate that in bringing forward Amendment 2, this amends a section which was included in the bill as a result of stakeholder feedback, in fact, stakeholder being ICAS, and we do not believe that Amendment 2 should be supported. I think the main issues undoubtedly surround Amendment 1 and the length of contribution period, Presiding Officer. So just let me address the debate. I'm grateful for all members' contributions. I've listened to them carefully this afternoon, as I have listened to the similar arguments in Stage 1 and indeed at Stage 2. And let me start off by making it absolutely clear. Only those who can afford to pay a contribution towards the cost of their bankruptcy do pay. Currently, only 1/3 of those people who are bankrupt in Scotland pay such a contribution. The remaining 2/3 make no contribution payment whatsoever. We do not expect that proportion to change. The fundamental principle which this bill recognises and this government supports is that we believe that those who can pay and who are able to pay from their income should make a contribution, but those who cannot should not. And this bill seeks to bring forward that principle and apply it in a fairer and more consistent way than has been the case in Scotland, for reasons which I think it's incumbent upon me clearly to explain. Before I do so, may I point out that those whose sole income comes from benefits will pay no contribution whatsoever. And I think that should be clearly stated because it hasn't emerged as yet from the debate. In assessing a contribution, Presiding Officer, there are currently at least 3 different methods of assessing how that contribution is calculated. Firstly, for those who enter the debt arrangement scheme, secondly, for those who enter a protected trust deed, and thirdly, for those who enter sequestration or bankruptcy. Now, at present, that means there are 3 different systems, 3 different mechanisms, and no consistency whatsoever. How is that fair? Surely we can all agree, setting aside whatever our political perspective may be, that if you have a system where those who can pay, do pay and should pay, then they should pay in accordance with a consistently set, fair formula, the same for everybody, not varying in accordance with what form of statutory solution they seek, whether debt relief or debt management. And therefore, the Common Financial Tool will bring forward that consistency. The Common Financial Tool, incidentally, a presiding officer, is one where we will encourage the inclusion in the permitted deductions from income of a measure of savings. This has not hitherto been automatically the case. We will come back to Parliament with regard to how the Common Financial Tool and the Common Financial Statement will be calculated. We will debate these things, I expect, in the Energy, Enterprise and Tourism Committee, but the Common Financial Tool will bring consistency and fairness across the board for the very first time. And that will end very real unfairness to a great number of people who either pay too much or too little. Now, I would have thought that that is something to which all members could subscribe. There have been some assertions which, with respect to those who have made them and repeated them this afternoon, I cannot see are correct, and I think it's reasonable for me to rebut them now. First of all, it has been claimed, I think by Malcolm Chisholm, who I know takes has a long history of taking a very compassionate approach to his politics. That is not in doubt. But he claimed that we would have the longest period in which debtors pay a contribution in the UK. That is not actually correct, because in England the insolvency measure known as an individual voluntary arrangements involve a payment being normally of 5 years. We are not proposing 5 years, although most credit unions wanted 5 years. We are proposing 4 years. In England, it's 5 years. So I'm afraid, factually, it would appear to me, with all due respect, that that needs to be corrected. Secondly, the payment period for protected trust deeds is now to last for 4 years. Now, we debated this on the committee, presiding officer. When we debated it on the committee, it was agreed unanimously. And I do have to ask, if it was something which Labour Party members were prepared to accept on committee, namely that 4 years was a reasonable length of time during which a contribution order should be paid, if it was all right for protected trust deeds, I cannot understand for the life of me how one could construct an argument that it's okay to have 4 years for protected trust deeds, but somehow it is iniquitous, unfair, shocking and causative of undue hardship if it were restricted, if it were more than 4 years, if it were not 3 years, as is now being argued. The Scottish Government did consult on these matters, and it was plain that credit unions made their views very clear. There is also some other important arguments. Those who enter into a debt arrangement scheme choose to pay their debts almost in full. They want to pay their debts. We should encourage that in Scotland, because most of us, presiding officer, do pay our debts. I'm quite sure there are many in the country and in the gallery today who struggle to pay their debts in these difficult times. They pay their debts, their mortgages, their rent, not for 3 or 4 years, but for 20, 25, 30, 40 years, their whole lifetime. I think we have to recognise that the people struggling with debt are not only those who have to face the difficulty of sequestration of protected trust deeds, but also the generality of the population, and have a balanced solution. And those who enter the debt arrangement scheme, who get into difficulty with debt, but who nonetheless wish to pay their debt off in full, pay for an average length of 6.5 years. 6.5 years, twice the length which the Labour Party say would be causative of undue hardship. And I do have to ask, I don't actually think the CAB said, as Jenny Marr imputed to them, that our measures would cause undue hardship. I think they said hardship, but perhaps that's a minor criticism. But if it is causative of hardship to pay a contribution for 4 years, then surely those who are actually paying off the debts under the DAS scheme and paying for 6.5 years are in hardship. It doesn't quite seem to be a consistent argument. Now, in response to what Murdo Fraser asked, I'd be happy to confirm in response to the Law Society's statement and briefing to MSPs that the Accountant in Bankruptcy will, of course, closely monitor this matter as it proceeds. But even before we get to that stage, I can assure Mr Fraser that we will bring to the committee the opportunity in some shape or form to discuss and debate the common financial tool. I think that would be, irrespective of whether we even need to do that, I think we should, and I undertake that we will do that, and therefore I'm happy to give that, that undertaking. I'm also slightly surprised that those who have argued against the bill today haven't mentioned the provisions of the Supplementary Financial Memorandum, because there they are, and this is why it's lodged. But if one looks, Presiding Officer, at paragraphs 36 to 42 of the Supplementary Memorandum, that deals with the issue of breakages, which Alison Johnson referred to. It calculates a range of estimated likely gross aggregate additional contributions. I haven't actually had any content in any of the contributions today challenging any of that from any of the members in this chamber. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, we recognise that it is extremely important to allow debtors relief under the bankruptcy and protected trustee option. But we must provide fairness to creditors as well, who must get a return on their money if it is reasonable that they should do so, including credit unions. We don't want them to suffer undue bad debt because those who can pay don't pay for a reasonable period. It is a matter of balance between the creditor and debtor. We believe that the measures we brought forward are fair, and for the first time ever in Scotland, I believe that once they are introduced, they will pave the way for a consistent system across the board, and I think that in itself will be worthwhile and a step forward.
Thank you very much. I now invite Jenny Mara to wind up and indicate if you intend to press or withdraw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll just make a couple of brief remarks. I think Malcolm Chisholm summed up our position very well, but I would say on the last 2 points that the Minister made, the evidence taken by the committee opposed the extension to 4 years. Now, the Minister cites the credit unions, but you would have to admit that many other bodies that gave evidence, they said against the extension to 4 years, including the Citizens Advice Bureau, who we've both quoted today. The Minister cites England about the 4-year bankruptcy, but he is not comparing like with like here, and I think he needs to be honest with the Chamber about that. Bankruptcy in England is not 4 years, and he is not comparing like with like. He is actually making Scotland have the longest period of bankruptcy in the whole of the United Kingdom, and not letting people get back into the economy to be economically active. Presiding Officer, I think these 2 amendments would improve this bill to stop the extension to 4 years and reinstate automatic discharge, and I would press both amendments in my name.
Thank you. At the moment, you're only pressing Amendment 1, and the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. Prior to that, since this is the first division of this stage, I will suspend the Parliament for 5 minutes. We will then return for a 30-second division. Order. We will now proceed with the division on amendment number 1. This is now a 32nd division, and I would ask that members cast their votes now, please. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 1 is yes 35, no 76. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. That then brings us to Group 5, Moratorium on Diligence, and I call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister in a group on its own, and I ask the Minister to move and speak to the amendment, please.
Presiding Officer,
Minister, before you commence, could I ask for the conversations across the chamber to cease, please? Minister.
Presiding Officer, Amendment 8. One of the benefits of this bill is that it will deliver for the first time a 6-week moratorium against diligence across all statutory debt solutions in Scotland. The moratorium will provide the debtor a reasonable opportunity to take advice. Amendment 8 provides that the moratorium protects against diligence against earnings that has not yet begun, but not that already in force. Generally, the moratorium will suspend the execution of continuing diligence. However, it is not the Scottish Government's intention that, for example, current maintenance arrestments already in place, which may provide important support for the recipient of such maintenance payments in respect of, for example, children, should be interrupted just to give the debtor space to decide what to do. I would stress that this is distinct from the effect of any subsequent sequestration in those diligences, which is unaffected by the bill. This guards against unintended consequences. It makes clearer to both the debtor protected and the creditor prevented from beginning new diligence how the moratorium will operate in practice and where the cut-off is. I move Amendment 8 in my name and I invite members to support it.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member has asked to speak, the question then is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I therefore call Amendment 9 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 6, and I ask the Minister to move formally, please.
Move formally.
Question then is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 6, recording certain documents in the Register of Inhibitions, and I call Amendment 10 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 65, 69 and 73, and I ask the Minister to move Amendment 10 and to speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Amendments 10, 65, 69 and 73 are minor but important. They could go in regulations, but we propose to include them here to fit the legislative scheme of the Act. Amendments 10 and 73 relate to the cases where bankruptcy has been recalled. They provide that on the granting of a recall, a certified copy of the decision is sent to the Keeper of the Registers of Scotland to be recorded in the Register of Inhibitions. This ensures that the inhibitive effect of sequestration of the debtor is lifted, restoring them, so far as practicable, to the position prior to sequestration. Amendment 69 deals with matters associated with the Bill's provisions for reappointment of a trustee, where assets are discovered at a later date. It provides that an inhibition can be imposed anew or renewed from the reappointment of the trustee, thereby safeguarding assets that vest in the trustee for the benefit of all creditors. Finally, Amendment 65 provides for notification to the Keeper where a matter in the register is affected by an order curing a defect in procedure. I move Amendment 10 and ask for Parliament's support for the remaining amendments.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member wishes to contribute to this, the question then is that Amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 7, Submission of Claims to Trustee, and I call Amendment 11 in the name of the Minister, which is in a group on its own, and I ask the Minister to move and speak to the amendment.
I'm grateful to ICAST for this improvement. Amendment 11 tightens the requirement on creditors to submit their claims to the amount they owed in a bankruptcy to the trustee in 120 days or less. Claims need to be submitted so the amount the debtor owes is clear and the rest of the process can begin. As it stands, the bill requires creditors to submit their claims by that deadline or provide a reasonable explanation why they could not. Instead, ICAST have suggested that creditors should be required to justify late submission on the basis of exceptional circumstances as a stricter test. I think this is useful in that it will help with the smooth running of the process, and I move and invite members to support Amendment 11 in my name.
Thank you. Once again, since I have no requests to contribute to this group, the question is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call Amendment 2 in the name of Jenny Mara, which has already been debated with Amendment 1, and I invite Jenny Mara to move or not to move.
Moved.
The member has moved the amendment. The question, therefore, is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division. This is a 1-minute division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment number 2 is yes 36, no 74. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Group 8, Discharge of Debtor. I call Amendment 12 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 13, 14 and 70, and I ask the Minister to move Amendment 12 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Presiding Officer, this group of amendments deals in different ways with the discharge of the debtor. Amendments 12, 13 and 14 make changes to the discharge process in full administration bankruptcy, and again I am grateful to the stakeholders who provided feedback and helped shape these changes. 12 extends the deadline for making representations in relation to discharge from 14 days to 28 days. This applies to all, but will be of particular benefit for the debtor in obtaining the benefit of advice before any appeal. I am grateful to Citizens Advice Scotland for suggesting this improvement. Amendments 13 and 14 slightly alter the process by which a replacement trustee is appointed where a debtor cannot be traced, by moving the task of notifying creditors about the appointment of a replacement trustee to the accountant in bankruptcy. This is a sensible, practicable step suggested by ICAS that also reflects the accountant in bankruptcy's continuing role. The last amendment, number 70, deals with the debtor's discharge from the minimal asset process, or MAP. We know the MAP will deliver accessible debt relief to those who need it most, and debtors will be charged less than half of what they are currently charged. They are currently charged £200. Under MAP, the charge will be reduced to £100. In order to deliver this saving, we need the MAP to be a modern, streamlined system. Amendment 70 helps with that streamlining. It removes some of the bureaucracy that would otherwise have to be undertaken at the point at which the debtor receives their discharge. Which is not necessary because the MAP results in automatic discharge and will be a more automated process for cases where there are no assets. I move Amendment 12 and invite members to support all of the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Minister. Could I remind members to ensure that devices are switched to off in the chamber, and also invite members who wish to have conversations to do so out with the chamber, please. Since no one else has asked to contribute to this group, the question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I now call Amendment 13 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 12, and I ask the Minister to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 14 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 12, and I ask the Minister to move formally.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 9, Assets Discovered After Discharge of Trustee. And I call Amendment 15 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendments 16 to 19. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 15 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Amendments 15 to 19 deal with circumstances where the trustee becomes aware of assets after the debtor has been given the discharge. There have been quite a number of cases where this sort of thing has happened recently as a result of PPI payouts. Amendments 15 and 17 allow that if the asset is worth less than £1,000, then no further action needs to be taken by the former trustee. There would be no point in pursuing a relatively small sum where the cost of recovering the asset was likely to be greater than the value of the asset itself. Amendments 18 and 19 place certain requirements on the former trustee. By this stage, the trustee, as well as the debtor, is likely to have received their discharge. The former trustee will therefore have a choice: either seek reappointment and realise the value of the assets themselves, or leave it to the accountant of bankruptcy to appoint a new trustee. If the trustee decides not to seek reappointment, Amendments 18 and 19 specify that he or she must provide the AIB with certain information, including the estimated value of the newly discovered asset and some of its history, why it should be included as part of the debtor's estate, and why it was not recovered in the first place. All of these amendments, I think, represent sensible improvements to the process. They have all been brought forward following meetings with ICAS, the recognised body for insolvency practitioners, and I move Amendment 15 and invite members to support these amendments in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member has requested to speak, I will put the question, which is that Amendment 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call Amendments 16 to 19, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, and I would invite the Minister to move Amendments 16 to 19 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 16 to 19? No? Since no member objects, the question then is that Amendments 16 to 19, if I could have silence please, that Amendments 16 to 19 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That then brings us to Group 10, recall of sequestration, and I call Amendment 20 in the name of the Minister, grouped with Amendments 21 to 42 and to 71. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 20 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Presiding Officer, there were concerns raised about our proposals for what is referred to in the bill as interim recall. The Law Society of Scotland, in their written evidence to the committee, said that, and I quote, "Interim recall is flawed. There can be no middle ground. Either a debtor is sequestrated or he is not." As I said in response to Hamzala Malik's amendments at stage 2, there are some practical operation matters to consider here. My officials and I have also had some very helpful discussions with the Law Society since then. In fact, I myself spoke to Michael Clancy of the Law Society just last week. We are therefore happy to propose amendments today which deliver on my commitment at stage 2 to remove the concept of interim recall from the bill. I have a great deal more here, Presiding Officer, but in the absence of a clamant demand to hear it, then I simply move Amendment 21 and invite members to support the remaining amendments in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Though, could I ask you to move Amendment 20 rather than 21?
So moved.
Thank you. Since there is no clamour of anyone to contribute to this either, I will put the question, which is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call Amendments 21 to 42 in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, and I invite the Minister to move Amendments 21 to 42 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Can I ask whether any member objects to a single question being put on Amendments 21 to 42? Since no member objects, the question then is that Amendments 21 to 42 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That then brings us to Group 11, replacement of trustee and removal of trustees and commissioners. And I call Amendment 43 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendments 44 to 53. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 43 and speak to all of the amendments in the group, please.
Amendments 43 and 4 amend Section 28 of the bill in order to enable with more ease a block transfer of cases from one trustee to another. The bill had provided for such a block transfer, but only in line with the existing provision in the 1985 Act for where the trustee was deceased or ceases to be qualified to act as a trustee. ICAS have pointed out that the usual circumstances which would give rise to the need for such a block transfer would be when a trustee has changed firms, has gone to work for a new firm of insolvency practitioners and are unable to take the cases with them. Amendment 43 therefore widens the circumstances in which a block transfer is allowed to include cases where there is a conflict of interest or a change in the personal circumstances of the trustee which prevents them from carrying out their duties. Amendment 45 provides that a block transfer may be carried out either on the application of any interested party or at the AIB's own accord. In either case, the amendment requires interested parties should be notified and given the right to make representations. Amendment 47 places a duty in the new trustee, where the new trustee is not the accountant in bankruptcy, to notify all creditors in the cases they have been appointed to, so that creditors are kept aware and up to date on developments. This group also deals with the removal of trustees and commissioners. Amendments 50 to 52 allow debtors, as well as commissioners and creditors, to apply for a declaration of the office of trustee as vacant on the basis that the existing trustee is unable or should not, on the basis of conduct, continue to act. This is a helpful improvement suggested by the Law Society of Scotland. Likewise, Amendment 53 is not a major amendment, but one suggested by ICAS and which we think improves the bill. It provides a new power for the Sheriff to remove from office a Commissioner in the circumstances where the Commissioner is no longer acting in the interests of the efficient conduct of the sequestration. The current practice of calling a creditors' meeting may not always meet the needs of the relevant parties, and in some circumstances it is expected that this amendment will provide for a more satisfactory process. I therefore move Amendment 43 and invite members to support the other amendments in the group in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Since no one else has requested to speak, I therefore put the question that Amendment 43 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. I now call Amendments 44 to 53, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. And I invite the Minister to move Amendments 44 to 53 en bloc, please.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 44 to 53? Since no member objects, the question then is that Amendments 44 to 53 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 12, Bankruptcy Restriction Orders. And I call Amendment 54 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendments 55 to 64. And I ask the Minister to move Amendment 54 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Bankruptcy restriction orders, or BROs as they are known, provide a mechanism for ensuring that people who abuse the bankruptcy process, for example by failing to provide information on assets or disposing of assets, have a restriction on their activities after their bankruptcy has ended. It is currently a sheriff who decides on BRO applications made by the accountant in bankruptcy. The bill has proposed that decisions on BROs, among other things, should pass from the Sheriff Court to the AIB. During stages 1 and 2 of the bill, I have listened carefully to representations from stakeholders, most recently, Presiding Officer, in a meeting I had with the Sheriffs Association, who had concerns about the proposals for BROs. The law currently allows BROs to be made for between 2 and 15 years. It has been highlighted to me that where a BRO is required for 5 years, it generally deals with cases of a more serious or complex nature, which have a significant impact on the life of the individual. As such, we have reconsidered that more serious cases of this nature would benefit from a judicial view. I am pleased, therefore, to bring forward Amendments 54 to 64, which provide that the AIB will have a responsibility for making BROs of between 2 and 5 years, but that the Sheriff will retain responsibility of BROs between 5 and 15 years. Provision of fair and just process remains central to our proposal. The AIB, as an officer of the court, is well placed to make decisions in relation to BROs. The staff of the AIB have been preparing applications for BROs for a number of years now. They do this in a rigorous and careful fashion, evidenced by the fact that every single application to a sheriff has been approved. Importantly, however, Presiding Officer, there is a right of appeal to the sheriff, and the bill retains that protection for all cases. Any BRO will be challengeable at any time before its expiry. I believe that the amendments now provide a better balance. They ensure the AIB can deal efficiently with BROs in more straightforward cases, minimising the burden on the court. More complex cases will benefit from scrutiny by the court. The right of challenge will exist for the duration of any BRO. I hope that Parliament will be supportive of these amendments, which address the concerns of valued stakeholders, and I move Amendment 54 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. Since no other member has indicated they wish to contribute, I'll therefore put the question, which is that Amendment 54 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Sorry, we are. I now call Amendments 55 to 66, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated, and I invite the Minister to move Amendments 55 to 66 en bloc, please.
Moved en bloc.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 55 to 66? Since no member objects, the question is that Amendments 55 to 66 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. We turn to Group 13, Appeals Against Review Decisions of the Accountant in Bankruptcy, and I call Amendment 67 in the name of the Minister in a group on its own, and I ask the Minister to move and speak to the amendment, please.
Amendment 67 is a lengthy but minor amendment which clarifies that appeal to the Sheriff from a review carried out by the AIB is a full rehearing of the matter. The new power of review by AIB is designed to ensure there is an opportunity for mistakes to be corrected and for earlier decisions to be challenged without the need to go to court, so people have access to justice and decision-making at the right level. The right, however, to appeal those decisions in court is also a very important aspect of this bill. The bill was consistent with existing provisions of the 1985 Act, but this amendment, in response to points made by the Sheriffs Association, puts beyond doubt the position already in the bill that such an appeal could be, in a matter of fact, a point of law or the merits of the case. It doesn't affect any other avenue of court review under the 85 Act. I move and invite you to support Amendment 67.
Thank you, Minister. And again, since no other member wishes to contribute to this part of the proceedings, the question then is that Amendment 67 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. That brings us to Group 14, Representation in the Sheriff Court, and I call Amendment 68 in the name of the Minister, which is grouped with Amendment 72, and I ask the Minister to move Amendment 68 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Amendments 68 and 72 provide for parties to be represented by persons other than solicitors in some cases in the Sheriff Court. Amendment 68 ensures that a person authorised by the AIB can conduct civil proceedings in the Sheriff Court in relation to the accountant's functions. The administration of bankruptcy cases does require the accountant to carry out functions which range from administrative to quasi-judicial. The accountant is an officer of court for this purpose. It follows that the AIB staff or associated agents should equally be able to carry out functions across the same spectrum, including representation in court. Amendment 72 ensures the current arrangements for the Sheriff to allow relay representation, for instance by CAB, in relation to the award of sequestration, can be replicated for discharge appeals under the bill. Wider powers in the Courts Reform Scotland Bill will replace these powers of the courts to allow lay representation in due course. I ask members to support these amendments and move number 68 in my name.
Thank you, Minister. And as no other member has asked to contribute, I'll move to the question, which is that Amendment 68 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Sorry, I'm going to call that again. Question is that Amendment 68 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I now call Amendments 69 to 82, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. And I invite the Minister to move Amendments 69 to 82 en bloc, please.
En bloc.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 69 to 82? Since no member objects to a single question being put, the question then is that Amendments 69 to 82 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. And that then ends consideration of amendments. I'll give members a few moments to reorganise for the debate. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 9365 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill. I would invite members who wish to contribute to this debate to please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to and move the motion. Around 10 minutes or so, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've had a good discussion on the Government's final package of amendments to this bill, and I like to think that the number of non-government amendments suggests that at the end of the process we have arrived at an overall consensus on most things, even if we do not agree on everything. I'd like to begin the final debate on the bill by thanking Murdo Fraser, the members of his committee, their clerking team, and all of those who have assisted with this Parliament's scrutiny of this bill. I would also like to thank my own officials and those in the Accountant and Bankruptcies Office for their excellent, efficient and lengthy support during this bill and indeed before it. We as a government, and my officials in particular, have appreciated the support of all of the stakeholder organisations who have engaged with us. It's a very long list. I think members will have noticed, Presiding Officer, that there are actually very few tidying up amendments, if I could call them that. Almost all of the amendments were amendments that we brought forward because ICAS, the Law Society, the CAB, the Sheriff's Association put forward points, suggestions. We had lengthy discussions with them, both before and after the introduction of the bill, but especially during the passage of the bill. And I think that the bill is now in better shape, and I'm extremely grateful to all of them for that. It's important that we do listen to stakeholders, and I'm particularly grateful to their support and advice and contributions throughout this bill. Now, I've already made it clear, Presiding Officer, that there needs to be a balance in bankruptcy law between the interests of the creditors and debtors. And for creditors, we stand by the principle that where the debtor is able to pay something towards the cost of their bankruptcy, they should do so. Creditors have a right to expect a reasonable return. The effect of bad debt on creditors, on small businesses in particular, can be extremely serious indeed, and we need to bear that in mind in striking that balance. Where someone is able to make payment of a contribution, then we have extended the period from 36 to 48 months. The Accountant of Bankruptcies analysis, as I alluded to in the debate on Group 4, Presiding Officer, has indicated that this move should give a rise to an improved return on creditors. I think that is what common sense would suggest. After all, if people pay for 3 years, then broadly speaking, they will pay for 4 years. That is what the lesson that we learn from other vehicles, and I see no reason why it should not, broadly speaking, apply in this case. But I was happy to give the assurance to Mr Fraser, which he reasonably sought. The Accountant of Bankruptcy will monitor these things very closely. Let's not forget, however, and I think this is really a critical point, and I do hope that all members will accept this now as we move towards the final part of this bill, that a contribution is only paid in less than a third of all bankruptcy cases. Only 1/3 of the people who are bankrupt in Scotland will pay anything at all. The most financially vulnerable debtors will not be required to make any contribution. Those whose sole income derives from benefits will not pay a contribution. They should not, they cannot, and they will not. And I think it's incumbent upon me to set that out extremely clearly. Credit unions have welcomed this change, and I've had positive discussions with the British Banking Association and representatives of high street banks. Lloyds Banking Group have confirmed to me this week that they should be able to support the provision. On the debtors' side, as well as mandatory advice, we will introduce a new minimal asset process, or MAP, which will deliver quicker, more efficient debt relief to debtors who need it most at half the cost. And I think that's a tribute to, if I may say so, it's not in the script, but it's a tribute to the efficiency of the Accountant of Bankruptcy and her staff in Kilwinning, that they are able so efficiently to conduct this business that they are able to do so at a cost of £100 per case. I think that really does indicate a diligence, devotion and an ability which we should all appreciate from public servants who do a terrific job. Indeed, I will have the pleasure of visiting once again the staff in the co-winning office formally to thank them for their work, I think, in the next couple of weeks' time. As well as the map, we will introduce a new common financial tool for Scotland, which will deliver for the first time a consistent determination of the amount the debtor can pay. Up to now, there have been various calculations applied which simply cannot be right, and I cannot overestimate the importance of this point. Up to now, we've had no clarity or consistency as between debtors who enter various different types of statutory solutions. Those who enter DAS, those who enter sequestration, those who enter protected trust deeds will pay contributions where they can, but there will be no consistency at all. That surely is wrong. It is not an easy thing to devise a common financial tool that is fair to everybody, but it has already been done, and we will be working very closely to bring forward clear proposals on this matter and debate them in Parliament in due course. And there is more we can do with the common financial tool. For example, we've been having discussions with members of our common financial tool working group and the Money Advice Trust about whether we can build a small allowance for savings into those determinations. I mentioned that earlier, and I do so again. Excuse me, Presiding Officer.
Your time, Minister.
Financial rehabilitation is what the bill is aiming for, and members have heard me refer to the government's vision for a financial health service before. The passing of this bill today will mark a major milestone towards making that vision a reality. We need this to build the financial capability of people in Scotland. By working with organisations such as church groups and credit unions, we will help support people to make better financial choices and prevent future problem debt. We want a financial health service to act on behalf of the people of Scotland, to put the case to credit reference agencies that there should be more of a differentiation in the risk scoring of people who have taken steps towards repaying their debts than those who have not. No credit appears to be given, for example, to those who pay their debts under the debt arrangement scheme by credit reference agencies. So that seems plainly to be wrong, and we are working with the BBA to see if it is possible to put that right. In addition, we believe that banks should play their part to allow accounts to be opened or to remain open, which can enable debtors the benefits, such as lower charges for household fuel and delivering products, from holding a bank account. If one has a bank account, Presiding Officer, as one knows, one has access to discounts by paying by direct debit. If banks do not allow undischarged debtors a credit-only account, then those debtors cannot access the discounts that you and I, Presiding Officer, can. That cannot be fair. The purpose of the amendments, purpose of the provisions in this bill that we've introduced to Parliament will be designed to tackle that. It is a counterpart of the provisions introduced down south, and it's designed for a worthy purpose. We do look forward to continuing engagement with the BBA and individual banks because, according to the CAB, only Barclays at present generally allows this service. We very much hope that all the banks will follow that example. We will also have a financial health service that brings together different strands and sources of information and advice, so that anybody with a concern or an issue to do with debt or borrowing can find in one place the help and assistance they need. Towards that end, Presiding Officer, I can announce today that the website of the Accountant of Bankruptcy will be rebranded in the autumn to become the website for and a portal to Scotland's Financial Health Service. Meanwhile, the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Bill is not the end of the process, but a new beginning. From here, the Financial Health Service will soon be a visible reality, and from here, bankruptcy will no longer just be a matter of accounting after the fact. It will also be about prevention before the fact. From here, debtors will be better advised, better informed and better supported. I think, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, these are commendable changes. More than that, they are essential changes, and I invite all members to support them and support the bill.
Many thanks. I now call on Jenny Marrett. 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The bill we have before us today, I would agree with the Minister, is radically different from the one that was presented at stage 1, and I would agree with him, a much better bill. Labour has argued throughout this process on critical areas of the bill that need to be changed in order for us to support it. Putting Scots into bankruptcy for longer than those in bankruptcy in any other part of the UK. Ending automatic discharge against the advice of the European Commission. Capping the amount of debt the poorest can have before entering bankruptcy, and then charging those self-same poorest a fee to enter it. At every stage of this bill, we have sought to rectify what we believe are unnecessary measures that unwisely tip the balance between recuperating monies owed and allowing people and businesses to become financially active again. Bankruptcy law, Presiding Officer, is important for many reasons. Not just because it provides a right of recourse to those who are owed money, but it also is a fundamental safety net of the state, with the function to help businesses that have failed in an economy that is still recovering, to support individuals who have fallen into financial difficulty, and good bankruptcy law can help build an economy that is inclusive not just for those who never have to worry about money, but for those who have found themselves in acute financial difficulty with the multitude of reasons that happens, and support those who have risked their own livelihoods to try and start their own businesses and build a better life for themselves and their families. Sometimes, Presiding Officer, families break down, leaving one party with nothing. Sometimes house prices fall so far that negative equity can render people insolvent. And sometimes the insurance won't pay out after a natural disaster. Sometimes businesses set up with the best of intentions and they fail for economic reasons not of their own making. As lawmakers, we have to be sensitive to the reasons that bankruptcies happen. And in the laws we pass, we must reflect that it is in the best interests of the Scottish economy to strive for economic inclusion as well as fair reparations. Presiding Officer, Labour's amendments at stage 3 would have, if they'd been accepted, in my opinion, done two very important things. Firstly, they would have reversed the Scottish Government's decision to put Scots into bankruptcy for longer than any other part of the United Kingdom. Secondly, they would have reinstated the principle of automatic discharge from bankruptcy, as envisaged by the European Commission's expert recommendations. I think the Government's failure to agree these changes is a missed opportunity, and it will hold Scots in bankruptcy longer than at present and make it more difficult and complex for Scots to get back on their feet. Yes.
Minister Fergus-Ewing.
My understanding is that the European Commission document to which she refers doesn't really apply to the generality of those who are bankrupt, but specifically small and medium-sized enterprises. So does she really feel that the document supports the arguments in the way that she has set out?
It's my understanding that the document does support the arguments that I'm making, Presiding Officer, but I assure the Minister I will go back and check that. I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary, the Minister, in light of the continued concern, not just of the Labour Party, but of those like Citizens Advice Scotland, to whom I know he's listened very carefully, whether he will commit to undertake post-legislative scrutiny in the form of review, a point raised by Murdo Fraser during consideration of amendments, of those two specific provisions in the bill on which I moved amendments, within 3 years of them coming into effect. This would give us some comfort around these provisions. That way, we can see what impact the changes are having on those going through bankruptcy and how they're affecting the efficient disposal of bankruptcies, which is essential to getting people financially active again. Presiding Officer, to date, the Minister has made significant changes to this bill. The fact that we were debating 80 amendments, which introduced whole new sections at stage 3, is rare, but it is welcome. And I think the Minister has listened to Labour's concerns on interim recall and removed it from the bill. While not reinstating automatic discharge, he has laid 2 separate amendments to clarify the process. While not removing the cap on debt to the minimal asset route, he has raised it to a point where the vast majority of the poorest people will qualify for the new route. And while not abolishing the charge for accessing the minimal asset route, he has reduced it by half after making the ill-judged decision to raise it to £200 earlier this parliamentary session. Presiding Officer, these changes, the fact that the Minister has listened to our points, combined with the creation of the Financial Health Service, which is very welcome, will mean that on these benches we will reluctantly support this bill today.
Many thanks. I now call on Murdo Fraser. 5 minutes or thereby.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to contribute to the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. When we get to stage 3 debates, usually everything that needs to be said has already been voiced. I therefore do not have a great deal to add to what I said in the stage 1 debate and also throughout the progress of the legislation. As convener of the lead committee, can I take the opportunity to once again thank my committee colleagues for their assistance in scrutinising the bill, to our committee clerks, to all those who gave evidence, and in particular to our committee adviser, Nicholas Greer. Much of the bill was technical, and it certainly assisted us to have both Nicholas and the team from SPICE on hand to guide us through it. And I think throughout the stage 1 process, committee members had a very thorough debate on a whole range of issues, many of which Jenny Mara has just mentioned. And all of us learned a great deal about the bankruptcy process. I think I was the only member of the committee who was a veteran of the 2005 bill when I went through the then Enterprise and Culture Committee. Even then, my knowledge had dimmed with the years, and it was good to be refreshed. And many of the controversial issues, some of which Jenny Mara referred to, it's fair to say the arguments were fairly balanced on both sides in relation to these. And I think the scrutiny the committee did was very useful in identifying exactly what the issues were. So when it came to actually voting on the bill, we could be clear what the implications were. And I would commend the Minister for the way he's taken the bill forward, and in particular the way he's consulted with interested parties. The bill has widespread support. I hear from Jenny Mara, Labour will be supporting it. We will ourselves. I'm sure we'll hear from other parties whether that support will be unanimous. But I think the general approach to this has been constructive from all sides. It's been about taking the law forward in a non-partisan way and seeking to bring an improvement. And that's right, because the focus of this bill is to ensure that the Scottish people have access to fair and just processes of debt advice, debt relief and debt management. Now, a key aspect of the bill is the introduction of compulsory money advice for those facing financial difficulty. It remains to be seen, of course, how effective this measure will be, but the aim of introducing it certainly is a laudable one. And the issue we need to very closely monitor is the extent to which additional resources are required to put this into practice and make sure that it works. This is a matter the committee discussed in detail when it was taking evidence. More generally, financial education, which of course is not the same as compulsory debt advice, but financial education is something that the committee members felt would be useful. I certainly think there's a role for this in schools. And we need to see people being aware of alternatives to very expensive sources of credit, such as payday lending, looking at how we can expand, for example, the role of credit unions, which are a very welcome and comparatively recent development. I thought it was one of the ironies of the evidence-taking process in the bill that when it came to many measures in the bill, the credit unions, usually as creditors in any bankruptcy process, took a much harder line approach to the bill, and particularly towards making debtors repay, than many of the other witnesses we heard from, including insolvency practitioners. And of course, I think that just brings into harsh reality the fact that credit unions lending money have to recover that money in order for them to have a future and make sure they're still financially solvent themselves. There has to be, in the way we address all these issues, a proper balance struck, because if debt relief becomes too easy, we create a moral hazard. It becomes too simple for people to walk away from monies that are due. But then, on the other hand, if it becomes too onerous, then we simply trap people who've fallen on hard times into a cycle of debt from which they can never escape. Now, striking that balance is always a challenge, and in my view the bill has been successful, but time will tell. One measure in the bill which is very welcome and introduced by the Scottish Government at stage 2, and which the committee identified during our process, was this provision to allow undischarged bankrupts access to bank accounts. This mirrors a similar provision which was brought in down south on a previous occasion. And I think this is very important because, as the Minister fairly said, having a bank account is now essential to modern life. Indeed, with the introduction of universal credit, all benefits in future will be paid into bank accounts. And having these removed from bankrupts would have caused them a real difficulty. It is now up to the banks to make the necessary changes to their policies to ensure that these accounts are made available now that the legislative framework which allows them to do that has been put into place, and I encourage the Minister to do that. Finally, can I just say, Deputy Presiding Officer, I very much welcome the introduction of the new minimal assets process. There continues to be a debate, as the Minister will know, as to whether the fee for entering the MAP, which is a maximum of £100, is appropriate, whether it is too high and will act as a deterrent. But I welcomed the evidence we got from the Accountant of Bankruptcy that this figure would be looked at in the light of experience, and if possible, that would be reduced. I'll have the opportunity a little later to add some comments, Deputy Presiding Officer, but at the moment I would just confirm that the Scottish Conservatives are very pleased to support this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now move to the open debate, and I call on Mike McKenzie to be followed by Richard Baker. 4 minutes or thereby, please.
Presiding Officer, this bill has an unfortunate acronym because there is nothing bad about it. It represents a necessary updating of bankruptcy legislation and offers benefits for both debtors and creditors. Much of Parliament's concern is rightly focused on the difficulties faced by debtors, but creditors too should not be ignored. My concern for creditors, though, does not include those in the payday loan industry, nor am I much concerned about the banks. I am concerned for small businesses that face real problems in dealing with bad debts. The man that fixed the washing machine, the local garage, the corner shop who helpfully offered credit. I'm concerned with credit unions also, whose good intentions often work against them. The return to such creditors have often in the past been very low, far too low. And that's why I like this bill, because it offers benefits to both debtors and creditors. And this is in part because the common financial tool is fairer to debtors, whilst achieving better returns for creditors, by the mechanism of extending payment for those who can afford to make payment over 4 years instead of 3 years. And I think that's an important point. Jenny Mara has argued that this will increase breakages, but evidence from the experience with DAS suggests otherwise. Breakages, when they occur, are much more likely to occur within the first 2 years and not as suggested in year 4. It's important to note too, as the Minister has said, that those on the very lowest incomes will make no payment at all. And those who can pay often say, and indeed many of them told the committee this, that they want to pay off their debts. They just require circumstances that make this possible. There are benefits too to be had from the efficiency of AIB. For instance, MAP must have a ceiling on debt that can be dealt with without complication and therefore efficiently. And I welcome AIB's aim to get the payment for MAP down to £100 and perhaps even below that, something that would be impossible with a higher debt ceiling. I also welcome, in the same interest of efficiency, AIB taking on some of the essentially administrative work that previously was done by the courts. The Scottish Government has demonstrated good practice in developing this bill, working with stakeholders throughout the process, and more importantly, listening carefully to stakeholders and, where possible, implementing the recommendations that they favour. So I'm delighted that the Government has taken action to help debtors keep bank accounts and to raise the threshold for MAP up to £17,000. Presiding Officer, in concluding, I must say that bankruptcy is inevitably a difficult process. That's why I warmly welcome this bill and also the recent improvements to the debt arrangement scheme, which is increasingly offering people a better alternative than bankruptcy. And I note that since the number of applications for the debt arrangement scheme have gone up, the number of bankruptcies has gone down. So I very much welcome that. Both the Scottish Government and the accountant in bankruptcy are to be commended for this.
Thank you very much. Now call on Richard Baker to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Presiding Officer, in parliamentary terms, I am now very wizened, and although I was not a member of the Economy Committee in its consideration of this bill before us today, in 2005, like Murdo Fraser, I was a member of the Enterprise Committee when we considered the Bankruptcy and Diligence Bill then. The goal of that legislation, which was also a highly technical bill, was to strike a better balance between the rights of creditors and debtors, to uphold the can pay, should pay principle, while helping those who, for whatever reason, genuinely struggle to meet the financial demands of their debts. Now, that's not always an easy balance to strike, and clearly achieving that balance in this legislation has been at the forefront of the minds of the members of the committee. And in the Stage 1 debate on this side, we came to the conclusion that the correct balance had not been struck between these competing demands, and particularly with reference to the debtor contribution payment period moving from 36 to 48 months, the subject of amendments from 1 and 2 from Jenny Marra debated in this chamber today. And while the Minister has expressed his view that this measure was not about full cost recovery for the accountant in bankruptcy, that view has been expressed by Citizens Advice Scotland and others, and they have expressed a concern it's not primarily the interests of debtors, for whom, after all, taking the step of entering into these arrangements is not one lightly taken. So I think it has been right to test the government's stance on this area, and I agree with the assessment of Citizens Advice Scotland that even if this provision is intended for individuals assessed as being able to make this contribution, the fact of the matter is that for these people, increasing the payment contribution period by a further year is very likely to cause hardship. An additional year of payments, administration fees and charges will not assist them in restoring their financial position, which is the point of the bankruptcy process after all. But as other colleagues have said, we acknowledge there has been movement from the Scottish Government in a number of important areas in the course of the Stage 2 consideration of the bill, including raising the minimal asset process bankruptcy level and offering £200,000 of funding to support financial education. And on the issue of providing support for financial education, this will of course be something which is welcomed by all parties in the chamber. So the provisions on compulsory money advice for bankrupt debtors and financial education for those for whom it's deemed will benefit from this are ambitions of this legislation which can be supported. Presiding Officer, I believe my own party has a strong track record in improving the laws of this land for those people who become unable to meet their financial obligations and require assistance to restore their financial position, at the same time as delivering fairness to creditors. And through measures like the debt arrangement schemes and support for money advice, while we were in government, we achieved those goals. But it's always right to review legislation in this area to ensure it is fit for purpose, and I'm sure ministers have been right to do so in this instance. There are a number of provisions in this bill we welcome today as representing progress in our laws on bankruptcy, but other elements of the bill where we will maintain strong reservations on their practical impact. I suspect this will be one of those pieces of legislation for which post-legislative scrutiny will be particularly important. And as Jenny Marra has highlighted, this is most important in terms of the debtor contribution payment period. Reflecting further on this legislation, once it has been passed, will be necessary. So as a Parliament, we can be assured it does in practice deliver a legal framework which effectively provides that balance in the law of which I spoke earlier, maintaining the rights of creditors while assisting those who can't meet the demands of their debt. But this bill must be part of that much broader work of government to help people in debt get out of it, and most importantly, for all of us to do whatever we can to ensure people do not take on unmanageable debt in the first place.
Many thanks. I now call on Tavish Scott to be followed by Chick Brodie. A generous 4 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I wonder if you'd allow me to start with a parliamentary point, and this is very much about Parliament and not about the Minister's handling of the bill. Today the Government introduced 80 amendments, which by any standards is a lot of amendments, and Mr Ewing very reasonably set out the case for that. He very reasonably didn't read his whole brief on occasion, which I suspect was a relief to the Chamber, although it did reflect that actually he probably should have done, because he probably should have read into the record the justification arguments that he was making on behalf of the amendments that he was proposing at stage 3. He cited on a number of occasions ICAS, the Law Society of Scotland and other bodies who had come forward with, no doubt, helpful suggestions at this last stage. But Mr Fraser's committee, the committee responsible for this bill, nor the Subordinate Legislation Committee, have looked at these measures, have looked at these amendments. There has been no effective parliamentary scrutiny by committee of a great raft of changes to law that we are passing today. Now, we clearly are going to pass it. It's clearly going to go through... yes, of course, yes.
Minister.
I mean, perhaps it's because I wasn't being sufficiently generous to Mr Fraser and his committee members, but I think it's fair to say that a great many of the amendments which we accepted today on the particular advocacy of stakeholders were also in pursuit of issues that had very clearly been identified by the committee and indeed identified in its report.
And I absolutely am sure that is correct. My point, and I repeat the point, I am not criticising the government of the day nor the minister responsible for the bill, but my point is that Parliament, even in those circumstances, does not at this time have a mechanism by which we can look into these things. We do not, in my view, have enough time between stage 2 and stage 3 of a bill to take the very point that Mr Ewing has just very correctly made. So I would ask that in our consideration of our own procedures, all governments, and it clearly isn't a matter for government, it's a matter for Parliament, do reflect on how we do these things. This is, after all, a bill which we broadly agree with, a bill where Mr Ewing, I think, has very reasonably made the case for his amendments, but we do have other occasions when legislation is by definition extremely controversial, and we had a recent example of measures on justice matters which were very firmly pushed through Parliament at stage 3 in highly controversial scenes. I repeat the point, that isn't the case today. On the bill itself, Presiding Officer, I recognise that the passage of the bill has addressed, as Mr Ewing, the Minister, just said, some of the, or indeed many of the concerns that were highlighted at an earlier stage. We on the Liberal Democrat benches do recognise that work and support the bill today. I particularly want to highlight the measure in relation to financial education. I've long believed and indeed argued for that at a number of levels, and I want to recognise the Scottish Government's commitment to provide additional finance to deliver in that area, and indeed the increase of the debt ceiling for minimal asset processes that Mr Fraser mentioned in his remarks. That appears to me to be an eminently sensible development of policy and of practice. I also want to recognise the work done with the money advice sector to predict the likely impact of the requirement for compulsory money advice, and we hope on these benches, and I'm sure Parliament hopes, that that demand will be monitored and that resources will be reviewed in line with any upward demand, any change in the requirement in that area. We are cautious about the ending of automatic discharge and certainly hope the Government will reconsider its approach on this. I noted with considerable interest the debate on Jenny Mara's amendments today. I'm not quite sure at the time that I understood Mr Chisholm's remarks that the Government who proposing this bill today is more right-wing than the Conservatives. I see Mr Swinney noticing that point. I suppose on corporation tax that would clearly be the case, but nevertheless the position after these amendments today, or rather the amendments today that were brought forward by Jenny Mara, is clearly more balanced than it was at an earlier stage, which is welcome, although limited in how far that has gone. We were worried, Presiding Officer, by the transfer of powers from the judiciary to AIB in respect of the arguments that were put forward at an earlier stage on conflict of interest. I do recognise the Minister's observations around progress in this area to reduce that conflict, and I trust that he would assure Parliament that that change will be carefully monitored to ensure that there is equality in sequestration cases and no doubt in other areas that that where this work continues. There is one area where we still do have remaining concerns, and that's why we did support Jenny Mara's Amendment 1 today. We believe that the extension of debtor contribution orders to 48 months will, if not carefully monitored, push people into further financial hardship. That cannot be the Minister or the Government's intention, certainly shouldn't be the intentions of law, and there are concerns that continues with what has happened today. Citizens Advice Bureau are not an organisation to be underestimated. I'm sure many of us who spend considerable time with them in our areas of Scotland, listening carefully to their points about the reality of everyday life for many people, would note their briefing that they provided for this bill. And I was concerned that the Minister didn't specifically pick up the points that Citizens Advice Scotland did make to Parliament in that briefing. There can be no doubt there are very many sensible and progressive measures in this bill. Many members have mentioned them already, and I'm not going to repeat them just so for sake of having them on the record. But I do want to observe that our contention that the bill does achieve a policy ambition which we very much support, but with that note of caution of the need for ongoing monitoring of the changes to ensure that a policy that should be supported is actually delivered in reality.
Many thanks. Now Colin Brodie to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, in my experience, largely with small businesses, or rather the owners of small businesses, the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority enter bankruptcy as a last resort. So it is also for those individuals subject to the conditions that Jenny Mara mentioned in her speech. Entering bankruptcy is not an easy option. Neither has been the leaving of it, nor indeed the consequences attendant to the leaving of it. This bill cannot, I believe, reflect or recognise the feelings, sometimes the hopelessness or the desperation of bankruptcy. What it can do and what it does do is it significantly adds to and improves existing regulation in relation to the conditions of the debtor or indeed protected trust deeds and debt arrangement schemes. And this partly mitigates the emotional consequences associated with bankruptcy. Above all, Presiding Officer, I believe it seeks, as best it can, to marry the obligation of the debtor to the best and acceptable solution for the creditor. One would wish that full comprehension of personal assets and liabilities was integral to education of everyone. Of course it isn't. However, as per the DAS system and protected trust deeds, education, understanding of the whole financial landscape that underpins debt and debt solution is paramount. Presiding Officer, with the appropriate resource and the quality controls, money advice, as Tavish Scott has just mentioned, compulsory money advice should be a bulwark against recurring bankruptcies and an acknowledgement to creditors as to the action that is to be taken. While that will focus as now on a few new entrants, as the estimate is some 500 entrants to bankruptcy, when linked to required financial education for existing debtors, be it online or additional face-to-face or hard copy support, then the spectrum of understanding might and should be greater. The proposed monitoring and measurement of these educational outcomes will determine the success of this much-needed function as espoused in the bill. And, Presiding Officer, that education, that understanding needs to be embraced and understood, I believe, also to some extent by creditors, so that the process of debt relief and debt management ensures a balance for both creditors and debtors alike. In striking that balance, Presiding Officer, to be fair to creditors and indeed to debtors, there has to be a balance of certainty. And that is why, after the consultation, it was right to set a payment period of 48 months to ensure certainty entered the arena from the 48 months from the date of the first payment. That is, I believe, the stake in the ground. But there is also recognition, as I mentioned in the intervention, if the debtor's circumstances change, then the variability comes into play as per Section 32, clauses 2b and 2c of the bill. Presiding Officer, the success or otherwise of the bill rests, I believe, on the role of the accountancy in bankruptcy. Whether it is acting as a trustee or replacement trustee, as an adjudicator on discharge, or as the prime decision maker on administrative matters, its responsibilities are fulsome, which I believe will be discharged appropriately with support in specific cases as required by the courts. That said, Presiding Officer, even in circumstances, perhaps too many, where a debtor cannot be located to allow us to play through the regime of the bill, where a debtor cannot be located, then rightly there should be no debt relief and discharge deferred indefinitely. That underpins the statement in the bill, in the policy memorandum, that the intention is that those who can pay should pay. That does not absolve immediately the trustees or AIB as an original or replacement trustee to make every effort to locate the debtor, but it should be clearly understood that those who can pay should pay. Presiding Officer, given the subject matter of the bill, it is difficult to welcome that which has made it necessary, but I do welcome the bill as it instills a greater confidence, a greater competence in a process that I believe will treat debtors and creditors fairly and alike.
Many thanks. And as we have completed our amendments ahead of schedule this afternoon, I am minded to accept a motion without notice on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau under Rule 11.2.4 Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to 4:40 p.m. this evening. Minister, would you be prepared to move such a motion? Thank you very much. So the question is, are we agreed to bring forward decision time to 4:40 this evening? We are. Thank you. I now call Malcolm Chisholm 4 minutes.
Here was me thinking I could speak for as long as I liked. So this is actually the first day.
It will still be a generous 4 minutes, Mr. Chisholm.
This is the first day that I have spoken on the subject of bankruptcy since the Bankruptcy Bill of 1992. And the Minister, having heard my earlier speech, no doubt thinks that is perfectly obvious. Then, as now, we were amending the 1985 Bankruptcy Act. In fact, we didn't really have any choice then, because the Bankruptcy Act prior to 1985 was 1621, and I suppose it's a mark of the success of devolution that we've had several debates and pieces of legislation about bankruptcy in just 15 years. It was, though, very interesting for me to read that debate, and one of the interesting things was, in fact, the Labour amendment on that occasion was asking for a special committee to be set up because it was a technical subject and it was necessary to hear the evidence of the experts in the field. And this was, I am sorry to say, was stubbornly rejected by Ian Lang after being eloquently proposed by Donald Dewar. But it did make me think how superior, certainly at stage one, our processes are, because I think the committee did a magnificent job with this bill, a very lengthy, detailed report, and all the people who had an interest in it had an opportunity to give evidence. Of course, having said that, and with reference to Tavish Scott's point about the scrutiny of detail, I did remember that in terms of the committee stage of the bill, we sat all night looking at the detail, and I still remember being there in the committee room at dawn when having discussed it all night. So I suppose it was just a different procedural world with advantages and disadvantages. There was another similarity, because then we were giving a big extra role to the accountant in bankruptcy because of a deficiency in the 1985 Act. And of course there is a similarity in terms of the transfer of some judicial functions to the accountant today. In fact, the Law Society still has reservations in their briefing to us about the removal of judicial involvement. But like Jenny Mara, I welcome several of the changes made at stage 2. One was about changes dealing with stakeholder concerns about the transfer of functions from the sheriff to the accountant. There was also the reduced risk to banks of offering accounts to undischarged bankrupts. That was very welcome. The removal of the concept concept of interim recall, a Labour proposal which was accepted and enacted by the Minister today, and also, of course, the changes dealing with the cap on debt for the minimal asset group and the reduced fee. So all that has been well covered and acknowledged by Jenny Mara. And of course there were other features of the bill that were welcome from the start, such as the access to fair and just processes of debt advice, debt relief and debt management, the provision of financial education through the Financial Health Service, and the use of the Common Financial Statement as a common financial tool. So there is much to be welcome, some of which has emerged as a result of the Stage 2 process. So clearly that stage of the bill has been successful for us in the Scottish Parliament on this occasion, as it often is. But I have to briefly repeat the concerns that were highlighted by Jenny Mara in her amendments earlier on. There are continuing concerns about the debtor contribution period. And if I can just make 2 points in response to what the Minister said, then he made quite a lot about England, but I think we were not comparing like with like. It was more like apples and oranges in terms of the situation in England that he was describing. And also he made reference to the views of the credit unions on this. I mean, there is an issue with credit unions, but the way to deal with that is to give them preferred creditor status, and it's regrettable that that opportunity has not been taken. Now, when it comes to the ending of automatic discharge, I'm certainly in no position to know whether it was against the advice of the EU Commission, although Jenny Mara said she would check the detail of that, but it does seem to be clearly against what is the EU norm, and I think that is certainly something that the Minister should reflect on. And as I said in my earlier speech, it is also against the progressive approach of the Conservative Party in 1985, although I better add on this issue only. Finally, I think the main additional point made by Jenny Mara in her speech, I hope, will receive a positive response from the Minister in his summing up. We talk a lot about post-legislative scrutiny in the Parliament. We don't do a great deal of it, and I think this is an excellent opportunity with reference to the 2 issues that Jenny Mara highlighted. So I certainly hope that after a period of 3 years or so, the government and the Parliament will look formally at these 2 contentious issues and see if there have been worrying consequences and also unintended consequences, because I think that was a point that Murdo Fraser's committee made in relation to the ending of automatic discharge.
Many thanks. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Murdo Fraser. 4 minutes, please, Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I just want to add briefly to comments I made earlier and reflect on some of the contributions in the debate. I very much welcome Malcolm Chisholm's recognition of how progressive the Conservative Party was in 1985. I listened with interest to his reminiscences about dealing with the previous bankruptcy legislation, and indeed Richard Baker's. In addition to my own, I would counsel members about being too enthusiastic on this subject, for there is a bankruptcy consolidation bill, I understand, in process, and a party whip near you will be coming soon, seeking members, I'm sure, to serve on the Consolidation Bill Committee, so just be careful about demonstrating too much interest in this subject, or you might find yourself inveigled into that particular position. I thought Tavish Scott made a perfectly fair point in relation to parliamentary process. To be fair to the Minister, the amendments the Minister brought forward at Stage 3 were not contentious and were in response to lobbies by third parties, and many of these issues were identified by the committee at Stage 1. But I do think there is an issue that, in that Parliament really had a matter literally of a few days to consider these amendments before we came here to debate and vote on them. And I think there is something we all need to reflect on in terms of the way this Parliament operates, as to whether that's sufficient time to give proper consideration to what could be actually very important matters. I think in terms of the wider debate, I think bankruptcy is a good thing. You know, we need to remember what bankruptcy is for. It is there to provide protection for debtors, for people who fall on hard times, to actually ensure that they are not continually being harassed and chased by those to whom they owe money. It actually protects them and lets them get back onto onto their feet. But there are implications from bankruptcy because, of course, it does make it very difficult for people in future to borrow money and indeed perhaps even set up in business and get back to their lives. So people should never enter it lightly. And we need to be careful to strike the right balance here because there is this issue of the moral hazard that I referred to earlier. Mike McKenzie made a very good point in the debate, and he did this, in fact, throughout the whole committee process of the bill, in reminding us that we need to have an interest not just for debtors, but for creditors as well. Because the word creditor sometimes just conjures up images of a large institution like a bank, or worse still, a payday lender, who doesn't really deserve, in our view, to get the money back that's due to them. In reality, of course, many creditors are not like that. Many creditors might be a small business that is due money for work done. And if that money is not repaid, that small business in itself could find itself in financial difficulty and could find itself brought down because the debts are not paid. And in all this debate, we need to remember there is a balance here, and making things too easy for debtors will have a negative impact on creditors, and that's not always a good thing. I think it's been excellent, Deputy Presiding Officer, how much consensus there has been around this debate. There have been a few issues of concern. Jenny Mara raised this question about the 48-month period for debtor contribution. But beyond that, I think people have pretty much been agreed. One aspect of this bill, very important in my view, is the provision of debt advice. A few weeks ago, I went to visit the new debt advice centre set up by Christians Against Poverty in Aberfeldy, providing help and assistance to those who are in money difficulties and falling on hard times in that part of Highland Perthshire. And that's a sort of hands-on practical advice being provided at a local level that is so vital to people and helps avoid them getting into the process of bankruptcy in the first place. Deputy Presiding Officer, can I just say in conclusion that bankruptcy is never a pleasant process for anyone. It is there, as I said, to provide relief from debts for those who've fallen on hard times. And it is the mark of a civilised society that we are able to deal in a compassionate way with those in those circumstances, while at the same time avoiding creating any perverse incentives for those who might look to abuse the rules. As I said earlier today, I think the bill strikes the right balance, and the Scottish Conservatives are pleased to support it at decision time today. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Ian Gray. 6 minutes, please, Mr Gray.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the desperate attempt to try and think of some way to inject some colour into this closing speech, I have toyed with the idea of making some play of the acronym for the bill, BADAS, but I did think that somebody would probably beat me to it, and indeed Mr Mackenzie didn't disappoint by pointing out that its acronym was perhaps more exciting than some of the passages of consideration. However, in this search for colour, I was drawn at the weekend to the many touching obituaries for Clarissa Dixon-Wright, which we saw in our newspapers. Clarissa Dixon-Wright, of course, famous as one of the two fat ladies, and latterly, indeed, a resident for some years of East Lothian, although fortunately, in fact, not the part of East Lothian which forms my constituency. I say fortunately because I fear that Ms Dixon-Wright was probably not a natural Labour Party voter. And that wasn't the only eccentricity that she displayed. Her whole life, of course, was one of great colour and eccentricity. And one aspect of that, of course, was that she was indeed bankrupt on no fewer than 3 occasions, and clearly did see bankruptcy as being a valid way of managing one's finances across time. Indeed, famously, when she was rector of Aberdeen University, she caused some consternation by going as far as advising the student body that the best way of dealing with their student debt would indeed be to declare themselves bankrupt, thus divesting themselves of the responsibility to pay it. So her approach to bankruptcy was pretty flippant, but I think the truth is, as Mr Fraser has just said, that bankruptcy is a serious business indeed, and an important one, and it's not something, as he said, which should be entered into lightly. It is only usually entered into in the most difficult of circumstances. So Labour's concerns throughout the scrutiny of this bill have been around proposals that we believe perhaps tipped the balance of financial obligation and economic re-engagement against the debtor, while placing an administrative burden, a new administrative burden, on our money advice services. Those concerns were not partisan, and Mr Fraser made clear that in the course of his scrutiny as convener of the committee that he had had similar concerns. They're certainly not trivial when we look at some of the evidence that was given in early scrutiny. The Institute of Chartered Accountants, for example, said that the bill would ingrain conflicts of interests. Quite a serious statement for them to make. However, the story of this bill, from when it was first introduced back in June to the point we find ourselves at today, is, as most speakers have acknowledged, a story of significant change, and that surely is encapsulated by the fact that we passed 80 amendments to it today, many substantial amendments, bringing in fact 2 new sections to the bill. So what began as a bill that perhaps threatened to roll back much of the good work done over the years to modernise our bankruptcy and debt relief laws, to encourage effective financial re-engagement, while clearly making sure there was a system of fair payment for creditors, that has, we believe, become a bill made acceptable by the significant efforts of Citizens Advice Scotland, the Law Society, ICAS and members from across the chamber, and, in fairness, by the Minister's willingness to listen to them and to respond by amending the bill. He's amended it around the burden on our money advice services when he announced at stage 2 additional funding. He's raised the cap on the minimal asset process. He has ensured, and rightly so, that those most in need of access to bankruptcy will have that access. And today he's further clarified the process of discharge and repatriated some of the powers to our courts that had previously fuelled concerns of conflict of interest, which I've already referred to. Chair.
Mackenzie. I wonder if Ian Gray would agree with me that listening to stakeholders, not just at the consultation phase before the bill enters Parliament, but all the way through, listening carefully and then reacting to what stakeholders' concerns is a great strength of the Scottish Government's approach to this bill.
Ian Gray. Well, I think I do agree with that, and a number of members have talked about the parliamentary process, and I've acknowledged indeed that the Minister did listen to much of that evidence. However, I have to say that although the bill is improved, it's still our view that it's not perfect. The decision to reject our amendments today... I need to ask you to draw your minutes to close. The decision to reject our amendments today, we think, was a mistake and weakens what could have been a better bill. And that's the basis on which we've called for a commitment to review this legislation within 3 years. And that, too, we think, is an important and useful part of parliamentary process. So I'm pleased that today we can find enough consensus across this bill, perhaps not on everything, but certainly enough to support the bill this evening and move forward to the next stage of what many members have described as a long journey going back to the 17th century, I think Mr Chisholm said, of our bankruptcy and debt arrangement legislation.
Thank you, Mr Gray. I now call on Fergus Ewing to wind up the debate. Minister, I'd be grateful if you could continue until 4:40.
Presiding Officer, thank you as always. I've thoroughly enjoyed this debate. It has been a very useful debate and a very helpful one where we have seen a remarkable degree of consensus, cooperation and forbearance, particularly since members had to listen to me speak for nearly 2 hours, which I would have thought would have been quite a degree of provocation for some. But we have reached a stage now where I think the bill has, thanks to contributions of members of the committee and of stakeholders, in a very much better shape than it was before, through, I think, a process of a willingness to engage, discuss, to listen carefully to what stakeholders have said and to respond where appropriate. And I'm grateful to Mr Gray for his remarks there and acknowledging that we have been willing to move on these matters. I'm afraid I don't have time to respond to all of the points that were raised, but Mr Chisholm mentioned why there was no alteration of the status of credit unions as preferred creditors. I should say this was considered in the 2012 consultation, but lacked any support beyond credit unions at the time. I should also say, in response to the point about discharge, which I think Jenny Mara made, just a reminder that amendments made at stage 2 ensure the process of discharge will commence automatically at the 10-month point, and the trustee will provide a report which will provide information on the cooperation of the debtor, allowing the accountant in bankruptcy to make a decision on discharge. And discharge at the end of 1 year will be the case for most debtors. Only those who have not cooperated will receive a discharge. And that is the point. What we are seeking to do here is to ensure that those who do not cooperate do not get a discharge. Now, of course, that is provided for in the current legislation, but this gives it new focus. The vast majority of debtors do cooperate, and therefore for them the process will be automatic. When comparisons are made about one's place in the political spectrum in relation to the 1985 Act, as Mr Chisholm made, I would point out that the period discharge brought in by the 85 Act, which in itself then was a welcome clarity, was 3 years. It is now, for the most part, 1 year, and that, therefore, is a step forward. Presiding Officer, in future, as Mr Fraser has remarked upon, and rightly so, we will be bringing in a consolidation bill during this parliamentary year to commence by April 2015, and the consolidation bill will modernise the language where appropriate and make it easier for practitioners, for advisers, really to follow what is now a very, very long, tortuous and complex chain of pieces of legislation, beginning, I think, in 1985, going through to 1993, and then with 3 or 4 other bills following. It's now very difficult for practitioners, lawyers, citizens' advice advisers, money advisers, sheriffs and accountants and solvency petitioners. So I think this will be, I think it may be the first consolidation bill this Parliament will consider, and rightly so. I'm happy to give assurances that both Mr Fraser and Ms Mara sought about a review of the extension of the payment period from 36 to 48 months. I do believe that it might be better that this be carried out in 4 years following commencement, where the effect of the changes will be made. But I do undertake, and I have already done so, Presiding Officer, and for the avoidance of doubt, that the Accountant Bankruptcy will monitor these things very closely, as she does in all other important material matters, and this will form a part of the work. And I'm quite sure we will regularly appear, as I do, Presiding Officer, before the Energy Enterprise and Tourism Committee, rightly so, to account for the Parliament, the Government's stewardship of regulation in debt, which is extremely important. So there's a great deal more work to be done on that. I was grateful that Mr Mackenzie highlighted, as he has done, as Mr Fraser fairly paid tribute, he highlighted the impact on creditors. There are thousands of small businesses around the country, and if there's a bad debt that they incur, that can put them out of business. What then is the effect on their family? Now, Mr Mackenzie, formerly a small businessman himself, I believe, highlighted this, and of course ministers receive letters along these lines as well. And we must remember, therefore, and Mr Mackenzie made sure that we did not forget that the process of this legislation is always a balance between the interests of the debtor and the interests of the creditor. I'm very pleased that the British Bankers Association have confirmed that it's comfortable that its members would apply the same approach to opening basic bank accounts for undischarged bankrupts in Scotland as they would in England and Wales, should legislation be laid in each jurisdiction having the same effect to remove the after-acquired property potential liability. Excuse me. So that done, it is clear that we have paved the way for banks to resume activity in this important area. And as I highlighted earlier, those who want to pay their bills and get a discount by paying by direct debit, and those who are bankrupt, unless they can get access to a bank account, they cannot get that discount. That must surely be unfair. And I hope that members of all parties would agree that this is something upon which we should all be urging the banks to adopt a fair approach of credit-only bank accounts, yes, but one which would make a very significant difference to some people facing financial difficulties. Presiding Officer, just to wind my remarks to a conclusion, I'm very pleased that the Labour Party has decided to support the bill. I hope I'm not being ungenerous in pointing out that it took a different view at stage one, I think substantially on the basis of the fact that they believe the payment period is, in their eyes, not correct. I'm not actually aware that there has been any substantial change to the bill. There's been many technical amendments, but the points of substance haven't really changed since stage one. So it's not immediately apparent to me why they have decided to change the view, but it is better that one sinner repents. So I wouldn't make an issue of that in any way whatsoever. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, could I repeat my thanks to everyone who has played a part in this bill in Parliament, out with Parliament advisers, and particularly my staff and Chris Boylan and Claire Orr and all the other staff who have assisted in the quite complex work involved here. This bill will set in Scotland a financial national health service, and I think this is the beginning of something which will reappear before us as we rightly try to ensure that people in Scotland are properly educated to manage their finances, especially young people, as members have pointed out. And therefore, I think it's a great day when this Parliament can move towards establishing a financial health service for Scotland.
Thank you, Minister. I am indebted to you for carrying on till 1640. That concludes the debate on the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill. We now move to the next item of business, which is decision time. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion number 9365, in the name of Fergus Ewing, on the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to, and the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill is passed. That concludes decision time.